Hello and welcome to the first online session of this series, Research on Emotions from the Philosophy of Mental Health. My name is Ferran Molins and I am a clinical psychiatrist. I am a member of the working group de treball de formació from the Associació Catalana de Professionals de la Salut Mental. We are a growing mental health professionals association in Catalunya with more than 200 members linked to the Spanish Asociación Española de Neuropsiquiatría. If you like our contents, do not hesitate to subscribe to our YouTube channels. We will leave more information of the association and how to become a member in the description. We are very grateful to all the amazing speakers who have accepted to participate in these webinars. Today, I would like to introduce the first of these speakers. Ingrid is a professor of philosophy at the University of Marburg, where she leads the research project Mental Images and Imagination, funded by the German Research Foundation. Her research is in the areas of philosophy of mind, epistemology, phenomenology, and aesthetics. She's author of 2 books and several articles. Her articles have been published in a Review of Philosophy and Psychology, Ethical Theory and Moral Practice, Journal of Aesthetics and Art Criticism, Topoi and Human Studies, among others. With that said, I will let Professor Ingrid to begin her talk.
Thank you, Ferran, for this presentation, and thank you also for inviting me to give a talk in the frame of your association. I have some PowerPoint that I would like to share with you, so I try it again if it works. Can you see the PowerPoint now?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So then I can start. I'm going to speak today about feeling as consciousness of value. And I start by indicating what is the phenomenon that I'm interested in my talk. There is a wide range of everyday experiences which seem to involve an immediate consciousness of value. Here, put some examples in the PowerPoint, and one is, for instance, you hear a colleague or someone you know to make an offensive comment, and you hear, when you hear this comment, that he's being rude. So you hear the rudeness of this comment. Imagine that you see someone risking her life to save another person. You will experience this action as a brave action, as something that is good and something that causes you admiration. So this is the kind of phenomenon that I'm interested in my talk. How it comes that you are able to apprehend these values or evaluative properties or axiological properties. Why in these moments the world is not presented to you as neutral, but as having an evaluative connotation. That's my project here. I will try to explain you how I think that it works, how these evaluative properties are apprehended in your experience. If you take a look in philosophy to contemporary research, you see that this apprehension of value has been explained in terms of judgments, in terms of emotions, or in terms of perception. So there are these people who say, yeah, you see that this action is brave because you judge the action as brave. Or there are the people who say, no, this action is for you a brave action because you have an emotion that it indicates you such. And then there are other people who say, no, it's a perception, a kind of perception. You perceive the action as brave. And my aim in this talk is to defend an alternative model according to which these values, evaluative properties, or axiological properties, I'm going to use these different terms as synonymous here, are apprehended by an intentional feeling. So my idea is that you feel that the situation is brave, or that is unfair, or that is rude, or whatever you can appreciate. You appreciate and apprehend that through a feeling, and it's an intentional feeling. That's going to be my claim today. This model of feeling has a very, very long tradition, and it has been defended in particular in early phenomenology. You can find authors like Adolf Reinach, Max Scheler, Alexander Fender, Edmund Husserl, and Edith Stein, who defend this model of feeling, but each one defends this model in its own way. So not all of them claim the same, but they share this intuition that you are able to apprehend evaluative properties by means of a feeling. It's important to remark that not all phenomenologists share this focus on feeling. You can find in the bibliography authors like von Hildebrand, who distinguish between seeing a value and feeling a value. And then later, other authors like Maurice Mandelbaum refer to this immediate seeing, awareness, or insight of the rightness or wrongness of an action in terms of a direct moral judgment. So we see that this model of feeling is a phenomenological model, but among phenomenologists, there are people defending different models, models which are not the model of feeling. In contemporary philosophy, this model of feeling has been developed taking inspiration from the phenomenological tradition, and it's quite interesting that you can find Husserlian models, so models based on Edmund Husserl, and these are the models provided by John Drummond and Søren Engelsen, for instance. And then you can find Schelerian models, so models based on the work provided by Max Scheler, and these are models that you will find in Roberta de Monticelli, Kevin Mulligan, or in Anthony Steinbock. You see that Husserl and Scheler are the two main sources of inspiration for contemporary research, but then there are other phenomenologists, early phenomenologists who work on that, but they are not that much taken into consideration today. So we see that today's models are inspired in Husserl or in Scheler. What is quite interesting is that these contemporary models of feeling come in different versions. Again, it's not the same Drummond model, Engelsen's model, Monticelli, Mulligan, Steinbock. Each one defends the model of feeling in their own way. And among them, there are points of convergence, but there are also disagreements. And I think that it's quite interesting to take a look to these disagreements as well. So my plan today is to defend this model of feeling, and I will do so in two steps. The first step consists in showing you the problems of the other models. I think that the model of judgment, the model of emotion, and the model of perception have much more problems than the model of feeling. So this is a quite pragmatic approach, but I think that it's an important approach because if we have a model that can explain a lot without encountering problems, so we should take that model and not models who have several problems. And the second step will consist in present an analysis of this feeling of value. So what is exactly feeling of value, how we can describe and characterize it. And contemporary versions of this model have been developed in parallel, but they are not in mutual exchange. So you will find a model of feeling in these authors that I mentioned you, but they do not discuss each other. So they take this inspiration from the phenomenological tradition, but there is no kind of dialogue between contemporary models. So I will try to put them in dialogue to see what it comes out from this hypothetical dialogue. And then if you take a look in particular to contemporary researchers working on emotion, you will see that most of them accuse the model of feeling of being a conceptual device introduced to self-a-theory, that it's an obscure and mysterious model, and I say also that it is inexistent. So there are people who say that this feeling of value does not exist, or that it's only a conceptual tool. So I think that we have to be aware that this is a possible accusation against the model of feeling, but I hope to convince you that this feeling of value is something that it exists and that is the best model of all. So I start comparing this model of feeling with its alternatives, that is the model of emotion, judgment, and perception. So in ordinary language, we refer to this immediate experience of value in terms of evaluating a situation, appraising a situation, seeing that a situation is unfair, perceiving the unfairness of a situation, sensing the unfairness, or feeling the unfairness. So if we take a look how we speak about the phenomenon that I'm interested in, we are quite lost, because here there are many things that are possible. So evaluating, appraising, seeing, perceiving, sensing, feeling are very different from each other. So the question is, how is the value apprehended? And now I will start with my comparison of these models. And I start with the model of judgment. This model has been defended by Solomon and by Nussbaum, and these authors explain the apprehension of value in terms of a judgment or of an evaluative appraisal intimately connected with our emotional life. And I think that this model has a positive point, and that is that it underscores the evaluative nature of the consciousness of value. The problem with this model is that it cannot accommodate other features of the apprehension of value. There is a first objection, and this is this one: the judgment that something possesses a certain value is not always accompanied by the experience of value in question. For instance, you can apprehend an insect as dangerous while at the same time judging and believing that this insect is inoffensive. So if this is possible, then the consciousness or apprehension of value cannot be a judgment, because you can have an apprehension of value on the one side and a judgment on the other side that go in opposite directions. The second objection is that the experience of value is quite immediate. You see the unfairness, no? You are able to grasp immediately what's going on. And by contrast, the notion of judgment suggests cognitive abilities, suggests a certain complexity of your cognitive life. And the third objection is that the model of judgment don't place the affective nature of the apprehension of value. And I think that this affective nature is very good illustrated in an expression coined by Kevin Mulligan, that is being struck by value. So you are really struck by this value, and this affects you in some way. And I think that the models of judgment cannot really capture this element, that is, you are affected by the value you are apprehending. Now I move on to the model of emotion. This is the most popular model, I could say, and this model has been endorsed mainly by Christine Tapolet, but there are many people defending this view that apprehending a value is having an emotion. And this model has a positive side, and that is that it emphasizes the affective nature of the consciousness of value, of the apprehension of value. However, I think that among the wide family of the affective states, the model of the emotion, it chooses the ground candidate. And there are many arguments against this model of the emotions, against the idea that emotions are apprehensions of value or perceptions of value. And these arguments have been put forth already more than 100 years ago by Adolf Reinach and Max Scheler, but you can find them today again and again in other authors like Engelsen, de Monticelli, and Mulligan. So you see, we have been for more than 1 century now attacking the model of the emotion, but it is still one of the most popular models. There are several objections against the model of emotion. I will start with the first one, and that is that there is no one-to-one correspondence between emotions and values, because different and even opposite emotions might arise in relation to a single value. This is a really strong problem for the model of emotion, and it was put forward already by Reinach, and in contemporary research it has been put forward by Kevin Mulligan. And the idea is, the model of emotion tells you that to apprehend a situation as unfair, it requires that you feel indignation. So the idea is, you have this value property, unfair, and you have the emotion indignation, and the indignation apprehends the value property of the unfairness. And this objection one tells you, yes, it might seem that it works well for this case, unfairness, indignation, but there is no one-to-one correspondence between your emotions and values, because imagine that you perceive or apprehend something to be good. You can have many different emotions regarding this good that you apprehended. For instance, you can admire something that is good, but you can also feel envy, so targeting the same thing. So it seems that there is no one-to-one correspondence between emotion and value. The second objection is an experiential objection, and that is that you can apprehend a value without simultaneously experiencing an emotion. So you are able to read the newspaper, to watch the news, and to say, oh, that's unfair, and to experience what is being said, the news that you hear or are you reading, this is unfair. But it can happen that you do not experience indignation. In fact, I think that we are all the time grasping our environment as having an evaluative property, but we are not all the time having an emotion. So that's something that this model of emotion seems to forget, that you are able to apprehend values, but you are not all the day emoting and emoting. The third objection is that to apprehend a value is neither appropriate nor inappropriate, but something that it takes place or not, while the emotions have appropriateness conditions. For instance, fear is appropriate if the object that you target in your fear embodies a danger. But your fear could be inappropriate if what you target is not dangerous, if it is inoffensive. With the apprehension of value, it doesn't work this way. You say, I apprehend something as unfair, and it can happen that you make a mistake and the thing is not unfair, but you will not say it's correct or incorrect, your apprehension of value. It can happen that it's like perceiving, it can happen that you tell me, oh, I see a ball there, but there is no ball there. The same can happen with your feeling. But with the emotions, there is this possibility to say they are appropriate or inappropriate. But with the feeling or apprehension of value, is like perceiving it happen or it not happen. And it can be that you have an hallucination if you want, but appropriateness or inappropriateness, it's not there the right place to apply these concepts. The fourth objection is that the apprehension of value and emotions are different in terms of how each one of these mental states occupies time. Emotions are usually mental episodes that stretch over time. They have a course of development and they are constituted by temporal parts. And one of these parts might differ from the others substantially. Imagine that you experience the emotion of indignation. This emotion might take, I don't know, can happen that you feel indignation for 3 days. It has a beginning of your emotional episode, then a course of development, and then it ends. You stop feeling indignation, or this indignation transforms into a mood, but it's something that it stretches over time. It has a temporal course. And each one of these parts can differ in terms of focus, bodily involvement, intensity, depth. There are different parts with different features. By contrast, the apprehension of value has a minimal temporal duration. And you can repeatedly, and do that again and again, apprehend a situation as unfair or as brave or as dangerous, but this apprehension is something that happens at once, and it's not something that it takes you 3 days to develop. And each one, it's something that it doesn't have parts, or it has only minimal parts. You just grasp something as unfair, but it happens at once. You cannot say, oh yeah, there is a beginning, a course of development, and an end, and each one has different features. No, it's something much more immediate, that it has no temporal development, unlike the emotions, which are temporally stretched. So I think that these 4 objections are enough to convince us that the model of emotion is not a good model. Even though it's a very popular model, it's not the model that explains how you are able to apprehend the evaluative nuances of your environment. So I move now to the next model, and this is the model of perception. And this model explains the apprehension of value in terms of a sui generis perception that is similar but not reducible to sensory perception. This model has been put forward by Robert Audi, and he defends the existence of a moral perception, and that it's a perception of moral properties. In his view, moral properties are perceptual properties. They are perceptible, but they are not the object of a perception. He says not everything that is perceptible is a perceptual property. There are also these moral properties, and you are able to apprehend them by means of a moral perception. So moral perception is not like sensory perception, but it resembles something. So it resembles sensory perception, but it's a sui generis kind of perception. And I think that this model captures the immediate cognitive nature and the experiential dimension of the apprehension of value without reducing it to judgment or to emotional responses. But I think that there are 3 reasons why I think we should resist adopt such model. And these are more like remarks. They are not really objections, but I think that it's something that we should keep in mind before we buy the model of moral perception. The first remark is that value properties, the fact that value properties are experientiable and can be apprehended by our mind, does not make them automatically the object of a perception, not even a perception of a sui generis kind. So perception is the dominant model to think about experience. Not everything what is experientiable is perceptible, nor are all forms of apprehension perceptions. So what I want to say here is that to claim that values are the object of our experience, that they are experientiable and can be the object of an apprehension, does not necessarily commit us to the model of perception. So we can say we are able to apprehend values, but we are not automatically committed to the model of perception. That's my first remark against this model. That's not an argument against the model, but it's something that I think we should take into account. The second remark is that there is an intrinsic link between this apprehension of value and the affective states. And that is this apprehension of value calls, demands, motivates us to respond affectively to the value in question. This idea is something that was explored by Max Scheler. And the idea is you apprehend something as unfair and you feel the demand. You are called to respond to this experience of apprehending unfairness with indignation. That is the idea that value properties call you to react in a certain form. And the same, so here the example that I put in the PowerPoint is that in apprehending the rudeness of a comment, we are called to respond with disapproval, dislike, rejection, and indignation. So, and this very close link between values and your affective life could suggest us that the apprehension of value belongs to the family of the affective. And therefore, it's not a perception, but it belongs to this family of the affective. But again, this is not an objection against the model of perception. It's more like a remark, something that I think that we should think about. And now it comes my objection against the model of perception. Apprehending a value and perceiving an object are both forms of being receptive towards reality. However, only the former exhibits a feature common to all affective states. In affective states, we are affected in a way whereby reality is presented under an evaluative light, according to which some features are made more salient than others so that we can orient ourselves in action and thought. So affective states in general, I think that involve a relation to values, because in affective states, reality is not neutral, but imbued with value and with evaluative properties. And by contrast, in perception, we are affected by reality, but not in evaluative terms. For instance, when you say, this object is cold, this is a case of perception. And here you feel that the object, you perceive the object to be cold, but this does not involve an evaluative dimension. If you say, this object is disgusting, it's clear a case of affective state because an object is presented to you as having an evaluative dimension. It's something that invites you to adopt a pro or a contra attitude stance towards this object. So now I focus in the model that I think it's more promising of all, that's the model of feeling. I have shown you the problems of the model of judgment, emotion, and perception, and I think that now we should investigate and explore the model of feeling. And this model, as I said at the beginning, has been endorsed today by John Drummond, Soren Engelsen, Roberta Monticelli, Kevin Mulligan, Anthony Steinbock, and I myself defend also this model in the past, but I am so convinced of this model that you see 2008, I published my first thing about the model of feeling, and 2022, I am still a believer of the model of feeling, so it's something that I think that is the right way to explain the apprehension of value. So I think that this model, unlike the previous model, can account for central features of the apprehension of value. First, unlike the model of judgment and perception, the model of feeling can explain the affective nature of the apprehension of value. Intentional feelings exhibit the hallmark of all states belonging to the family of the affective, in that objects are imbued with value. So objects are presented to us as having a value in all the family of the affective and also in this feeling of value. The model of feeling can account for the affective nature of the apprehension of value without encountering the problems of the model of emotion. The feeling of value can explain why there is no one-to-one correspondence between value and emotion, why we not always have an emotion when we perceive a value, why emotions might be inappropriate, and why the apprehension of value is not temporally extended. So the other models had problems explaining all that, but the model of feeling can explain that very well. So this suggests that we should distinguish between the intentional feeling of value on the one hand and the emotional response of the other. What this model tells you, and what all these authors defend, is that you are able to apprehend a value by feeling them. You feel that something is unfair, and then you are called to respond with indignation, but indignation might or might not take place. That's what this model tells you. The feeling of value and the emotion are two separate things. They are close to each other. One causes the other, but they can take place separately. The model can account for the experiential dimension of the apprehension of value without reducing it to perception. For the proponents of the model of feeling, evaluative properties belong to a domain of reality which is experientiable, but whose experience cannot be explained in terms of perception. Values have their own mode of giveness and evidence which cannot be explained in terms of perception. So this model thinks that there are different spheres of reality. They are the sphere of reality of material things that you can sense with your sensory perception. And then they are the sphere of reality of values, which you are able to grasp thanks to your intentional feelings. This means that someone who cannot feel values, who cannot have these intentional feelings, will not have any access to this sphere of reality. That's a very strong thesis, but it's the thesis, it's a consequence of this thesis. If you have a distortion in your feeling of value, you will apprehend values also in a distorted way. So that's the main idea behind this model. As I said to you before, we find this model. Sorry, I have to. As I said to you before, we find this model defended several times in contemporary research, but each author defends it in its own way. So what I'm going to do now is to present you what I think are the main features of this feeling of value. And the first one is that the feeling of value is an immediate experience of value. And here I think that it's important that we distinguish between non-originary and originary forms of consciousness of value. Non-originary forms are directed towards a value property, the unfair, but they are not responsible for apprehending this value property. For instance, you can imagine something that is unfair. You can remember something that is unfair. You can believe that something is unfair. You can desire that something unfair happens to someone else. In all these cases, you have a mental state, imagination, a memory, a belief, a desire that is intentionally directed towards an object, and this object is presented to you as having the value property of the unfair. But all these different mental states presuppose that you are already familiar with the property of the unfair, either because you have experienced that before, or because you know that because you have read about it, or someone has told you that, whatever. None of these mental states is able to grasp the value property of the unfair. And therefore, in phenomenology, we call them non-originary forms of consciousness of value. And then we have here the originary forms of consciousness of value. And here the value is immediately presented, grasped, disclosed, or given to us in the consciousness of value. In these forms of consciousness of value, you are not only directed towards the unfair, but you are also able to apprehend the unfairness. You are able to directly experience the quality of the unfair as an objective property of the target of the object. Unlike non-originary forms, this originary form of consciousness of value do not presuppose that you are familiar with the value in question. So, and this must be a feeling, because we have seen all the others, imagining, remembering, believing, desiring, already presuppose that you know what is the unfair, but only feeling seems to be able to apprehend immediately without having necessarily previous knowledge of it, what is unfair. It can happen that when you start to grasp that you grasp only something is bad, and then you become, that your apprehension of value is refined through the time, and also that knowledge about the property of the unfair makes you more expert in apprehending the unfairness. But the point that I make here is that forms of consciousness that are able to grasp the unfairness, there must be a feeling, because all the others presuppose that already the unfairness is known to you. This feeling of value, I think, that is founded upon other forms of consciousness. And this is quite interesting in contemporary research, because you find some authors like Steinbock and de Monticelli, who following Scheler argue that this feeling of value is the primordial form of consciousness that is not founded upon other forms of consciousness. And in contrast, we find other authors like John Drummond, who think that this feeling of value is founded, it requires other forms of consciousness of value. And I think that John Drummond is right. I mean, in this point, I cannot agree with Scheler and his contemporary proponents, because to feel that something is unfair, you first have to grasp the other properties of the object, and which are not evaluative in nature. And I think that I can explain you how it works with the example of a bouquet of flowers. So you think about a bouquet of flowers, and you think that imagine you find this bouquet of flowers beautiful. This beautiful, it's an evaluative property of the flowers, but it's an evaluative property that it depends on non-evaluative properties like the colors of the flowers, the shape of the flowers, the combination of the colors and shapes. So if you take the same flowers and you combine them in another way, it can happen that this bouquet of flowers turns ugly, that it's not beautiful anymore. And I think that this shows you that the evaluative property of something is founded on non-evaluative properties of the object. I think that the feeling of value is not reducible to other forms of consciousness. And this claim seems to be accepted by all people defending the model. And the idea is clear: a feeling cannot be explained in terms of a memory or an imagining or a believing. It's something that is sui generis as such. The feeling of value is able to apprehend evaluative properties of different kinds. So the idea is that the expression feeling of value indicates an achievement of the mind, and it's employed as a success term. It's like perception. You know, you say, I perceive my table, so it's a success term. It works. I have perceived that. It can happen that I do not perceive the table, or that I perceive the table with the wrong color. But when I say I perceive the table as white in this case, then it's an achievement. It's something that I did well, that I succeeded in doing. And the same happens with the feeling of value. It's a success term. When you say, oh, I feel that something is unfair, then this is an achievement of your person, of your mind. And then there are some people who say, yeah, you are able to perceive or to apprehend or to feel just very general value properties, like something is good or something is bad. And others say, no, you are able to have a very, very fine apprehension of value, and you are able to perceive not only good and bad, but also dangerous, unfairness, rudeness, braveness, beauty. And there are no concepts in contemporary research on how to interpret that. Then there is a view defended by John Drummond that the feeling of values gives you a very general apprehension of the situation as good and bad, and then the emotions do the rest of work and tell you, yeah, because you feel fear, this what you felt as bad now is given to you as dangerous. And I think that the model is not really convincing, especially if you take a look to aesthetic properties, because you are able to perceive beauty, banality, and something sublime or deep. You are able to perceive all that without having an emotion all the time. And this is why I think we should keep the emotions outside this picture, because the feeling of value can do more than some people think. The idea is also that this feeling of values is able to make us acquainted with values, and how should we understand this acquaintance? I think that it's not knowledge of what it is like, that it presupposes that you already have a concept, because I think that you can become acquainted with a value even if you don't have a concept for this value. And there is in the discussion a thought experiment by Engelsen, who makes a comparison between another thought experiment put forward by Jackson, who imagined a woman called Mary who knew everything about colors, but was closed in a black and white room, and she never had seen a color. So she knew everything about colors, but she was living in a black and white room. And in the moment in which she goes out of this room for the first time, she sees red or blue or whatever she sees. And the idea of Jackson is that she knows something new. She knows how it is like, what it is like to see a color. And Engelsen says a bit, it can happen the same with values, that you know what it is like to experience something unfair when you have this experience. And I think that the analogy with the Mary is, in this case, not really good, because Mary had a concept of the color before she went out of the room. But we are able to apprehend values even if we don't have concepts for the value in question. I mean, if you have the concept, it could be better, your apprehension, but you are able to grasp something is wrong, even if you do not know exactly that is unfair or dangerous or whatever. Okay, I explained you already this. Exactly. So here is that it's better to think that we become acquainted with value and not that we know what it is like a value. So that was my conclusion. This feeling of value is a punctual occurrence, is something that it's episodic, that it's occurrent, and it does not extend over time. That's an important point. Punctual occurrences are achievements which can be dated, but which occur in a single moment without stretching over time. And the phenomenology of the feeling of value, I think that it's much closer to the phenomenology of some other occurrences, such as noticing or realizing. These are things that happen in a single moment. If I'm here talking to you and I notice there is a noise there, this happens in a moment. Or when I'm here giving this talk and I realize I had forgotten something, this happens in a moment. And I think that these are mental occurrences that are very, very short, that they're short-lived. And I think that the feeling of value is the same. They are very short-lived mental occurrences, and that they indicate an achievement. When you notice something, when you realize something, when you feel a value, you achieve something, and you do that in a very, very short portion of time. The feeling of values is a form of receptivity towards reality. And there are some authors like John Drummond who use these terms reception and response almost as being synonymous. And I think that here we should distinguish two different forms of human sensibility. On the one hand, there is this receptivity, involves the ability to be open to values. And then there is the responsivity, which requires to be able to react appropriately towards these values that you apprehend. And I think that the feeling of value is a form of receptivity, a form of sensibility, and then the emotions can be a form of responsivity. But we have to separate both forms of sensibility. Okay, so now I come to the end, and I put you here two bibliographical references. In the first one, I tried to explore the historical sources of this feeling of value. I do that in an article 2015. And then the second reference is a systematic defense of the feeling of value. And I did that more recently in this paper that's called Feeling as Consciousness of Value, like my talk today. Okay, so I came to the end. Thank you so much for your attention, and I am happy to discuss with you now all questions.